The summer of 1982-83 will long be remembered in Victoria as the year of the big drought. The whole state fell victim, and in the Mallee region in the northwest of the state, the long dry lasted from the middle of 82 until the following March, when the first substantial rains fell. During that prolonged dry period, the Mallee's two main farming enterprises, wheat and sheep, were severely affected. The wheat crop failed, simply because there was not enough rain, either to plant new seed or for a crop to grow. And with little or no pasture growth, almost half the sheep of the Mallee were forced to leave the region, while those that remained had to be hand-fed with grain or hay. The land itself suffered too, with wind erosion causing widespread soil movement. The light, more erodible sandy soils were the hardest hit and the most difficult to control. In parts of the Mallee, huge sand drifts blew onto roads and railway lines and blocked vital water supply channels. Altogether, more than 600 kilometres of channels were blocked, and it cost more than $1.5 million to clear them. Farm fences and gates became victims when they disappeared under drift accumulations, but the real loser in all this soil movement was the farmland itself. If you needed convincing, you should have been in Melbourne in early February, when the city was blacked out by a freak dust storm that deposited thousands of tonnes of topsoil from drought-affected areas to the west of the state on the city and suburbs. An average of 7 kilograms fell on every house in Melbourne. A dust storm like that is certainly dramatic evidence of soil movement, but what causes it? By far the most significant cause in the Mallee was simply overgrazing, both of pasture and of failed crops. Failed pea crops were probably the worst areas, particularly where the previous crop stubble had been burnt and the surface finally cultivated before the new field peas were sown. The shortage of paddock feed forced sheep to eat all surface vegetation, which in turn, of course, triggered wind erosion. Because most dams in the Mallee are filled by channels, water was never really a problem during the dry, but the lack of feed certainly was. And as paddock feed slowly disappeared, drought feeding of sheep was necessary, and on some farms lasted for up to 7 months. But despite these severe conditions, there were some encouraging examples of stable areas where the vegetation, either pasture or stubble, had been retained, which meant that little or no erosion was taking place. There was no soil loss and no drift damage to fences, gates and roads. For example, this retained vegetation is the residue of a 1981 crop, which was only lightly grazed. It was able to protect the soil surface from the erosive effect of the drying winds. In those areas without protective cover, it was still possible to control erosion with emergency drift control measures. In heavier soils, for example, the land was cultivated to produce a rough, cloddy surface, which reduced the wind's velocity at the surface and therefore avoided soil drift. In medium to heavy soils, wind ridging ploughs were used to throw up ridges at right angles to the wind direction. These reduced the wind velocity at the soil surface between the ridges. The best results were achieved with a ridge spacing of 3 metres. In lighter soils, however, emergency drift control measures were less successful. Because of the lack of soil moisture to bind the sand together, the ridges were soon smudged out and did little to reduce the wind's carrying power. On heavy soils, only one cultivation was necessary to produce a cloddy surface which controlled soil drift for the duration of the drought. Ridging was also successful in controlling drift on medium to heavy soils, but only proved to be a temporary measure on light sandy soils.
I'd been talking to the Soil Conservation Authority and they said they had a ridger on the drawing boards, and by mid-December our situation was getting quite serious again, and we ridged that country then in December, and that country held from then on right up till the break in the early autumn.
Yeah, what sort of acreage would you say you've actually put under ridges now then?
Well, we had 500 acres under before Christmas.
And that was a one-off exercise, or did you have to repeat some of it? Did it get blown down at all?
Very little, Tom, 10 acres.
That'd be on the lighter sands.
True.
Yeah. Now, most people seem to be a little bit afraid of ridging because they have fears that they won't be able to knock the ridges down when the exercise is all over. How have you gone now that with a bit of rain? How have you gone about knocking them down?
Well, we had fears too. However, the break that we had in the early autumn such a beautiful saturating 2.5 inches of rain that conditions were ideal to pull the ridges down and break any clods that were there. It was a two-exercise job. First there was a scarifiering. We scarified the way the ridges were ripped, and then we cross-worked with a field span.
So there was not that much work really, and was there clay left on the surface, or the reasonable surface left to sow on?
Now, having sown the paddock down to peas, you can see very little clay particles in the topsoil.
Yeah. Well, going back a little, as far as effectiveness, how do you think you would have went if you hadn't have done that ridging?
I'd be frightened to guess what could have happened. You know, I believe that we've lost a minimal amount of soil, topsoil, thanks to that ridger. Chisel ploughing was very effective for 2 months, but the wind was so severe and conditions as they weren't going to, such that the ground was just going to keep drifting.
Yeah. Just a few details on the ridging exercise itself. What sort of orientation? They were all north-south, or?
Yeah, we did rip about 90% north-south, and then we ripped some country southeast to northwest. Yeah.
Protection against south-west winds. Yeah,
Yeah,
very common. Yep. So the whole exercise, as far as even looking at cost-benefit, you think you're well ahead?
I'd imagine so. It's hard to calculate just how much you would lose, but certainly if you lost a lot, you'd be in big trouble, I'd say.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd have to be ahead.
So much for controlling the soil. How do you best manage sheep during a drought? The main thing is to get all sheep off erodible areas. They must not be allowed to wander all over the farm, destroying what little protective vegetation there is. In the Mallee, several strategies were used. These included agistment and total hand feeding of the sheep, which were locked into confined, non-erodible sites. One farmer who did this was Reg Wilkinson.
Looking at the paddocks, I believed that if I was going to keep sheep, I had to do it what I considered to be the proper way, and I could see that the way the hills and the paddocks were looking, I had to lock them up.
What sort of area did you look for to lock them up in?
Well, I didn't have a lot of choice. The paddock that I had available, well, it's a 60-acre piece, as you can see, and it's reasonably heavy ground, and it's got 10 or 12 acres of scrub there on the hill where they can shelter.
Water and hard ground?
Yeah, that'd be well, I mean, it's natural that you've got to have water, but the hard ground, it's not always easy to get a paddock that is fenced off as a little heavy flat, but I had to compromise to a certain extent because I have got a rise in that paddock, but I couldn't help it.
Do you think that you're going to achieve increases in production in other areas? Do you think your paddocks haven't blown as much because your sheep have been locked up here?
Oh, certainly, Hamish. The pasture paddocks are still looking quite sound, and even at this stage there's no erosion whatsoever on them. But that's the pasture paddocks.
Do you think that if you were going into a drought, if you knew a drought was coming upon you again, that you would do the same thing again?
I wouldn't be frightened to take the exercise on again, although it's always hard to make judgments when it's a drought and how long it's going to last. And what I did with this, in this particular instance, was I sold the sheep that weren't suitable. They were getting old, and I was never particularly happy with the mob I had before, so I bought a new mob of sheep. I bought a mob of sheep at Yalta, and the sort of sheep that I thought would grow into valuable sheep if I could take them through to after the drought. Not that I intend to sell them, but hopefully I'll have a good line of sheep when I finish.
In Oyen, John Crook was able to bring his sheep through the drought by agisting them.
We kept 200 old ewes at home that we intended to shoot. We just left them on borrowed time, and they struggled through all right. Yeah. But no, we had 3,000 away. Yeah. Virtually the whole mob.
And that's a well worth exercise from your point of view?
Oh yes, it certainly has been, yeah. We've got a lot of hidden costs that are probably going to crop up before we, realise just whether we made a lot of money or whether we didn't, but we've got our ground and we've still got our good breeding ewes left, so that must be worth something.
And they're not back now. This is now mid-May, and they're not back now.
No, well, possibly we could hold about half of them here now, but we're cropping and we can't be cropping and carting sheep home at the same time. But we'd just rather, now that we've got them away, let the pigs have a good recovery before they're brought back.
Yeah, because a lot looks pretty green, but a lot of it will be what weed stuff.
Oh yeah, I'd say
not much value.
3/4 of the growth's, you know, only looks good. It's not very palatable to the sheep.
Yeah. And how did the rest of your farm survive through the drought, say on your cultivation paddocks? Your crop was reasonable, so you had reasonable cover?
Oh, it wasn't too bad in most places. We had a few spots that gave trouble, but overall most of the drift wasn't actually moving out of the paddocks. It was blowing holes, you know, that had to be sort of scraped in later. But no, overall it was, you know, it wasn't too bad.
So you didn't have to resort to any ridging sort of exercise?
No, we did a little bit right at the end.
Yeah.
And I think about a week before it rained, but...
Well, you put that down to mainly that the fact that you got a lot of your stock off, you didn't have the problems, therefore didn't have to get into any sort of ridging?
Yes. Even when we shifted the sheep away, we had, you know, no ground that looked as if it would blow at all, but I think everybody was, you know, surprised just what shifted once the winds, and, you know.
Yeah, on what was normally thought to be fairly safe sort of
we
ground.
recognised as a pretty safe country.
Yeah.
The retention of surface cover, particularly through stubble retention and the controlling of grazing, were two major factors in reducing the effect of wind erosion in the Mallee during one of the severest droughts experienced in the area.
Well, I've come to the point where I believe we have to sow our grain legumes into our standing stubbles, and we have two problems with this practice. Firstly is a chemical. We need a chemical which will activate in a high trash situation.
Yes.
Secondly, we need a machine which is going to, with precision, place the seed in the soil at the right depth amongst the trash, which is going to protect firstly the young seedlings, secondly the paddock after the grain legume crop is harvested. There is a few machines appearing on the market, and also farmers are improvising with chisel ploughs and some other machines with high trash clearance, but they're not placing the seed precisely where it's wanted in the soil at the right depth.
Yeah, so it appears that, like most of our wind erosion problems, really surface trash is one of the main answers to keep that there at the vulnerable periods, be that in the fallow situation or prior to and just immediately after crop.
Yes, well, I think this is will emerge from this drought, is that we have to go into a system of stubble retention. Our old practices of burying the straw in the ground with disc implements, it has to go because of the problem which we have come through. So we need, I think, to keep the trash on the surface where it doesn't break down as quickly, and this then protects the soil from the strong winds which we get normally on every year. And I remember Wally Watson and Barry Willick, one of his philosophies is that he treats every year as a potential drought up until the opening rain.
Yeah, good comment.
The drought of 1982 and 1983, if nothing else, demonstrated the need to preserve surface cover on low rainfall cropping land.